Welcome to Creepy Corner Stories, where the shadows come alive and the walls whisper secrets of the past. Deep in the forgotten corners of the world stand places shrouded in darkness and despair, places like the abandoned hospital. These crumbling walls have witnessed unspeakable pain, whispered last words, and housed shadows that never left. Tonight, we dare to step inside. From phantom footsteps echoing down empty corridors to the chilling cries of those who may never have crossed over, these halls are alive with tales of terror. Turn down the lights, hold your breath, and prepare yourself for the stories lurking in the void of this forsaken hospital. This is Creepy Corner Stories, and these are the horrors you'll never forget. Let's begin.
Story: The Haunting of St. Mercy's Hospital.
St. Mercy's Hospital stood on the edge of town for over 100 years. Once a busy place where people came to heal, it was abandoned 40 years ago after strange deaths and unexplainable events. Over time, the hospital became a scary, broken-down building that drew curious visitors looking for ghosts. One story tells of Evelyn, a kind nurse who disappeared one night in the 1980s. Her things were left in the staff room, and her car was still in the parking lot, but she was never seen again. Some say she never left the hospital. People who entered the abandoned hospital reported strange things. They heard cries echoing through the halls. Lights flickered even though there was no power. And many said they felt like someone, or something, was watching them. One Halloween night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the hospital. As they walked through the dark halls, they heard the sound of a gurney being wheeled down the hallway. They called out, but no one answered. The noise grew louder until it stopped right outside the door. When they opened it, no one was there, but they saw a trail of wet footprints leading away. Others tell of shadows moving in empty rooms and cold whispers brushing against their ears. Some visitors say they've even seen Evelyn, still wearing her nurse's uniform, standing in the halls. The hospital is locked up now, surrounded by a rusty fence. But late at night, some people claim to hear voices coming from inside, calling for help. Is it Evelyn? Or is it something far more terrifying? Would you dare to go inside? Or would you leave the ghosts of St. Mercy's alone?
Story: The Ghosts of Hollow Hill Hospital.
Hollow Hill Hospital was once a place of healing, built in the early 1900s to care for the sick and injured. But over the years, it became a place of fear and sorrow. Understaffed and overcrowded, patients were often neglected or mistreated. Strange disappearances and unexplained deaths began to plague the hospital, and whispers of hauntings grew louder. By the 1970s, Hollow Hill closed its doors for good, leaving behind only its dark secrets. Decades later, the hospital became a hotspot for ghost hunters and curious explorers. Those who entered reported strange occurrences, faint whispers coming from empty rooms, shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, and the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. One particularly chilling story involves a man named Eric, a photographer who decided to document the abandoned hospital. Armed with a camera and flashlight, he entered the building alone. The air inside was cold and heavy, and every sound seemed to echo endlessly. As Eric explored, he began to notice strange things. In the pediatric ward, a row of dusty toys sat neatly on a shelf, though he was certain they hadn't been there when he first walked in. In the surgical wing, the old operating lights flickered on, even though there was no power in the building. But the worst came when Eric reached the basement, where the hospital's morgue was located. As he stepped into the cold, dark room, his flashlight flickered and went out. He stood in silence, surrounded by pitch-black darkness. That's when he heard it. A faint, raspy voice whispering his name. Panicked, Eric fumbled for his backup flashlight. When he turned it on, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room, motionless, its head tilted as if watching him. Eric didn't wait to see what would happen next. He ran, not stopping until he was outside the hospital and in his car. When he reviewed the photos he had taken later, he noticed something chilling. In nearly every picture, faint figures could be seen in the background, standing, watching, waiting. To this day, Hollow Hill Hospital remains abandoned, its halls filled with the echoes of the past. Some say the spirits of the patients and staff are trapped there, reliving their final moments over and over. Others believe the hospital itself is alive, feeding off the fear of anyone who dares to enter. Would you step inside and face the ghosts of Hollow Hill? Or would you leave the past undisturbed?
Story: The Shadows of Greystone Hospital.
Greystone Hospital was built in 1922, a sprawling complex designed to treat patients with long-term illnesses. For decades, it served as a beacon of hope, but behind closed doors, stories of neglect and tragedy began to spread. By the late 1960s, the hospital had become a place of despair, with overcrowded wards and patients left to suffer in silence. When it was finally abandoned in the 1980s, it was said that some of its residents never left. Years later, the hospital stood as a crumbling relic, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. Despite warnings to stay away, it became a popular destination for thrill seekers. But not everyone who entered came out the same. One night, a group of friends decided to explore Greystone Hospital. They had heard the stories: ghostly figures roaming the halls, faint screams echoing through the night, and lights flickering in the windows even though the building had no power. Armed with flashlights and a camera, they climbed through a broken window and stepped into the darkened halls. The air was cold, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their footsteps. As they moved deeper into the hospital, they found signs of its dark past: rusted medical tools, old patient records, and empty wheelchairs left to decay. In one room, they found an old hospital bed with restraints still attached. The walls were covered in scratch marks as though someone had desperately tried to escape. As they stood there, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and one of them swore they heard a faint whisper. "Help me." Shaken, they continued, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. In the main hallway, they saw a figure standing at the far end, a shadowy silhouette that didn't move. Thinking it was a prank, they called out, but the figure slowly turned and disappeared into a side room. When they reached the room, it was empty, but the sound of heavy breathing filled the air around them. Their flashlights flickered, and the group decided it was time to leave. As they made their way back to the exit, the hall seemed to stretch longer, and the doors slammed shut behind them, one by one. Finally, they escaped, gasping for air as they stumbled into the night. When they reviewed the footage from their camera later, they found something chilling. In almost every frame, shadowy figures could be seen watching them, lurking just beyond the light. To this day, Greystone Hospital remains abandoned, its dark halls filled with stories of those who never made it out. Some say the spirits of the patients remain, trapped by their pain and suffering. Others believe something far darker haunts the building, feeding on fear.
Story: The Forgotten Souls of Ravenwood Hospital. Ravenwood Hospital was built in the 1930s, tucked away in the hills outside a small town. It was once a beacon of hope for patients suffering from tuberculosis. However, as medical advancements made the hospital obsolete, it was abandoned in the late 1960s. Over the years, it fell into ruin, its dark halls and crumbling walls becoming a symbol of the lives lost within. Locals avoided Ravenwood, calling it cursed. Stories of strange happenings began to surface: flickering lights in the empty windows, strange shadows moving through the halls, and screams that echoed in the night. Despite the warnings, the hospital became a target for ghost hunters and daring explorers. One such explorer, a young man named Jake, decided to visit Ravenwood one stormy evening. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of adventure, he stepped into the decaying building. The air was damp and cold, carrying a faint metallic scent that made his stomach churn. The faint sound of rain tapping on the broken windows only added to the eerie atmosphere. As Jake walked through the hallways, he noticed the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and words scratched deep into the paint. He tried to brush it off as graffiti left by other visitors, but the deeper he went, the stranger the symbols became. In the old patient rooms, he saw rusted beds and shattered glass, but it was the children's ward that made his blood run cold. There, small handprints covered the walls, some smeared as if they had been dragged downward. A faint giggle echoed through the room, though Jake was completely alone. Determined to continue, he made his way to the surgical wing. There, in the middle of the operating room, was an old gurney covered in a faded, blood-stained sheet. Suddenly, the room grew icy, and the sound of metal instruments clattering to the floor made him jump. When he turned, he saw a figure standing in the corner. It was a woman in a tattered nurse's uniform, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. Her hollow eyes seemed to stare straight through him. Jake froze, unable to move as she slowly raised her hand and pointed toward the hallway. Snapping out of his trance, he ran. The hospital seemed to twist and turn, the hallways longer and darker than before. Shadows darted around him and whispers filled the air, growing louder until they became screams. Finally, he found the exit and stumbled into the night, gasping for air. When Jake returned home, he noticed something strange on his phone. Although he hadn't taken any pictures, there were dozens in his camera roll, blurry images of dark hallways, broken windows, and shadowy figures standing just behind him. To this day, Jake refuses to speak of Ravenwood Hospital. Locals say the spirits of those who died there still linger, searching for peace, or for someone to share their torment. Story: The Silence of Hollow Creek Hospital. Hollow Creek Hospital was built in the early 1900s, located on the outskirts of a small town surrounded by dense woods. It was initially founded to treat soldiers returning from war, but over the decades it became a place for those with mental health issues, many of whom were forgotten by society. By the 1970s, rumors about the hospital began to spread. Stories of unethical treatments, mysterious deaths, and patients who vanished without a trace were whispered in the town. Eventually, Hollow Creek closed its doors, and the hospital was abandoned, left to decay in isolation. Years later, a local college student named Emily, fascinated by the ghost stories surrounding the place, decided to investigate. Armed with only a flashlight and a notebook, she made her way to the decaying building on a quiet, moonless night. As she stepped inside, the overwhelming silence greeted her, broken only by the creak of rotting wood underfoot. The hospital was filled with old, rusted equipment, peeling paint, and the lingering smell of decay. She wandered through the wards and hallways, her footsteps echoing unnervingly in the empty space. In one room, she found old patient files scattered across the floor, with names she recognized from the ghost stories, the forgotten souls of the past. In another, she discovered a row of empty beds, some still with remnants of old sheets and restraints attached to the headboards. The sight of them made her skin crawl. But it wasn't until she entered the morgue that the true horror began. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath visible in the air. She reached for her flashlight, and as it flickered to life, she saw something that made her blood run cold, an outline of a figure standing at the far end of the room. The figure was blurry at first, but as she stared, it slowly came into focus. A man in an old hospital gown, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes hollow. Frozen in place, Emily tried to move, but her feet felt heavy, as if the floor itself was holding her in place. The figure started to move toward her, its footsteps slow and deliberate, but there was no sound. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, and the figure reached out a hand toward her, its fingers stretching unnaturally long. Just as it touched her arm, Emily snapped out of her trance and bolted toward the exit. Her heart pounded in her chest as she raced through the dark hallways, the sounds of footsteps echoing behind her, though she couldn't see anyone following. The door was locked. She pulled at the handle, panic setting in, and finally, the door burst open on its own. When Emily made it outside, gasping for breath, she turned around to look back at Hollow Creek. The lights in the windows flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the building. In that moment, she knew she had just escaped something that had been waiting for her to enter. Weeks later, Emily began to experience strange things. She would hear soft whispers when no one was around, and sometimes she would catch glimpses of a figure standing in the corner of her vision. On her phone, she found a photo she didn't remember taking, of a figure standing in the doorway of the morgue. Some say Hollow Creek Hospital is still haunted by the lost souls of the patients who died there, trapped by the memories of their pain. Others believe the hospital itself is alive, feeding off the fear of anyone who dares to enter. Story: The Crying Nurse of Ashford Sanitarium. Ashford Sanitarium was built in 1915, nestled in a quiet, remote part of the countryside. Originally designed to be a peaceful retreat for those suffering from mental illnesses, it quickly became infamous for the harsh treatments and unethical practices that were carried out behind closed doors. Many patients, both young and old, were left in the care of nurses and doctors who seemed to have no compassion for their suffering. Over the years, numerous reports of abuse, unexplained deaths, and strange disappearances were whispered around town. In the early 1970s, the sanitarium was shut down after a scandal involving the mysterious death of a nurse named Margaret. Margaret was known for her gentle nature and was well liked by the patients. But one fateful evening, she disappeared without a trace. Her co-workers reported that she had been acting strangely in the days leading up to her disappearance, whispering about the voices she heard in the walls. After an extensive search, no sign of Margaret was ever found, and the sanitarium was closed shortly afterward. Decades passed and the building slowly decayed. The once beautiful architecture fell into ruin, and the halls were overrun with ivy and darkness. Despite its abandonment, the town continued to talk about Ashford, warning anyone who would listen about the haunting that plagued the old sanitarium. In the early 2000s, a young woman named Claire, a student researching local legends, decided to visit Ashford Sanitarium. She had heard the stories of the crying nurse, how, on quiet nights, you could still hear the soft sobbing echoing from the upper floors. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and her curiosity, Claire set out to uncover the truth. When Claire entered the building, she immediately felt a chill in the air, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The halls were dark and suffocating, the smell of mildew and rot thick in the air. As she moved through the building, she noticed the old walls were lined with faded photos of the nurses and patients who had once lived there. She paused in front of one of the photographs, a group shot of the staff, with Margaret standing in the center, her eyes wide and filled with an unsettling sadness. Suddenly, she heard it, the faint sound of someone crying. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, as if someone was sobbing just around the corner. Claire hesitated, her heart racing. She followed the sound, her footsteps echoing through the hall. As she rounded the corner, the sobbing stopped, and the air grew even colder. In the dim light of her flashlight, Claire saw something that made her freeze. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, dressed in a nurse's uniform, her face obscured by her long, dark hair. The figure was motionless, but Claire could feel its presence, like it was waiting for her. "Margaret," Claire whispered almost to herself. Without warning, the figure turned toward her, and Claire's blood ran cold. The nurse's face was pale, her eyes hollow and black, filled with a deep, endless sorrow. She reached out her hand, her fingers elongated and twisted. As she did, Claire heard a whisper, "Help me, please." Panicked, Claire ran. She stumbled through the hallways, her heart pounding in her chest, but the sobbing followed her, growing louder and more frantic. When she reached the stairs leading out of the building, the door slammed shut before she could escape. The crying nurse was now standing at the top of the stairs, blocking her exit. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the nurse slowly descended toward her. In a final desperate move, Claire bolted for a nearby window, breaking it open and escaping into the night. She ran until she could no longer hear the sobbing, her chest tight with fear. The next day, Claire returned to the sanitarium to gather her things, but when she entered, the building was completely different. The walls were bare, the rooms empty. Even the photos of the staff had vanished. It was as if Ashford Sanitarium had erased all traces of its past. The only thing left was the memory of the crying nurse, forever trapped in the halls, waiting for someone to listen. Some say Margaret's spirit still roams the sanitarium, forever searching for someone to help her. Others believe she is cursed, bound to the building until the voices in the walls stop calling her name. Story: The Silent Wards of Briarcliff Hospital. Briarcliff Hospital was founded in the early 1900s, perched atop a hill on the outskirts of a small town. It was originally a state-of-the-art medical facility, designed to treat the mentally ill and offer a safe place for those suffering from serious conditions. However, over the years, the hospital's reputation began to change. Reports of cruel treatments and inhumane experiments on patients became common. It wasn't long before rumors of strange happenings and unexplained events started to surround Briarcliff. By the late 1960s, the hospital had become notorious for its secretive nature and eerie atmosphere. As time passed, many patients died under mysterious circumstances, and some even disappeared without a trace. Briarcliff was eventually shut down in the 1970s, its doors locked and the building left to crumble in silence. For decades, no one dared to venture near the abandoned hospital. But that didn't stop the stories from spreading. People claimed to hear strange noises at night, soft whispers, heavy footsteps, and the sound of doors slamming shut. They said the ghosts of the patients who had suffered there still wandered the halls, searching for answers or a way out. One night, a young man named Tom, intrigued by the stories, decided to explore Briarcliff Hospital for himself. Armed with only a flashlight and his camera, he made his way up the overgrown path to the front entrance. The air was thick with fog, and the tall, crumbling building loomed like a shadow in the night. Tom hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity pushed him forward. As he entered the hospital, he was immediately struck by the oppressive silence. The air felt cold, and the walls were lined with peeling paint and faded hospital signs. Tom ventured deeper into the building, his flashlight flickering in the darkness. The rooms were empty, save for remnants of the past. Old wheelchairs, rusted medical equipment, and the remains of old patient records scattered on the floor. But as he explored, the silence began to feel heavier, as though something was watching him. A chill ran down his spine when he heard a faint sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the hallway behind him. He turned quickly, but no one was there. Nervously, Tom continued on, but the sounds followed him. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped, only to start again in another part of the building. He hurried through the hallways, trying to find the source of the sound, but every turn led him deeper into the maze-like structure. Finally, he reached the heart of the hospital, the old psychiatric ward. The air here was colder, and the oppressive feeling seemed almost suffocating. Tom entered one of the rooms and froze. There, in the corner of the room, stood a figure. A woman in a hospital gown, her face hidden by a tangle of long, dark hair. She didn't move, but Tom could hear her breathing, shallow, ragged, as if she were in pain. His heart raced as he slowly stepped closer, but as he did, the woman turned toward him. Her eyes were wide and empty, her mouth open in a silent scream. Before Tom could react, the woman disappeared into thin air, leaving only the sound of her scream echoing through the walls. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and Tom's breath became visible in the freezing air. He felt a cold hand brush against his arm, and he spun around in terror. Without thinking, Tom ran, the sounds of footsteps and whispers chasing him down the halls. As he reached the exit, the doors slammed shut, trapping him inside. Panicked, he pulled at the door handle, and just as he thought he might be stuck forever, the door creaked open. Tom stumbled out into the night, his heart pounding in his chest. When he returned home, Tom reviewed the footage from his camera. His eyes widened as he saw something horrifying. In the reflection of the hospital windows, a pale face appeared, watching him. And in one of the rooms, a shadowy figure moved in the background, just out of focus. To this day, Briarcliff Hospital remains abandoned, a forgotten relic of a dark past. Some say the spirits of the patients who died there still roam the halls, trapped in a place where they were once forgotten. Others believe the hospital itself is cursed, feeding off the fear of those who enter. Thank you for watching and joining me on this haunting journey through the remnants of these forsaken hospitals. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying stories from the deepest corners of the unknown. And remember, when the lights go out, the silence might not be as empty as it seems. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and always beware what lies in the shadows. Here at Creepy Corner Stories.